In this video, we'll be looking at data types and data structures. So there are three main elements in any good software design. Those are knowing the syntax of the chosen program language, such as C#, knowing how to organize data, otherwise known as data structures, and then control structures. Now, data structures are really important because there are better ways of organizing data dependent on the need of what you're doing with your program. So there are two types of data structures. We've got simple and complex. Now, your simple data structures are ones that store only one particular data type. So there are four that you need to know for software design development. The first is integer. Now, integer is a whole number, positive or negative, generally used in counting, and you'll see that they're used mostly in what we call our loop structures, such as our pre- and post-test loops. However, they can be used also for other sort of needs, such as age. We've also got our floating point, or otherwise known as real. This is for decimal numbers that can be infinite in length and also positive and negative. I would use these for calculations. You've also got strings, which are the most common type of data type. And this lets you store anything in terms of alphabetic, symbol, or number. So you'd use this for text or sentences or anything like that. Very common in terms of programming is the string data type. And the last one that we'll be looking at is Boolean, which is basically something is either yes or no, true or false, male, female. Basically, it's often sometimes referred to as flags, but basically it's a state where it can only have one of two possible combinations. The structured data types, or complex data types, they come in different types. We will just cover these briefly in terms of knowledge and look at them further in the course. The first is what's called an array. Now, an array basically is a list of a single data type. So imagine that you want to store everyone's name in a particular class. You could have an array of strings, which then lets you have a list of first names or last names. And arrays are really powerful because that lets us actually search and sort them, which is really important if you think about typical programs nowadays. Searching and sorting is pretty much a mandatory requirement. Now, you can have different types of arrays. You can have a single-dimensional array or one-dimensional array, which stores one data type, or you can have multi-dimensional arrays. Now, a multi-dimensional array refers to how many different types of data are stored. So if I refer to a two-dimensional array, I'm saying there's two types of data. So I might have a two-dimensional array that stores both the first name and the last name. If I have a three-dimensional array, I add a third element. So obviously they raise in complexity the more dimensions you put on. For the purpose of year 11, we'll be focusing on one-dimensional arrays. You can also have what's called a record. Now, a record is basically a data structure that lets you store different types of data types under a particular ID. So if you look at school, for example, you would have a school record, which would have string of first name, last name. It might have a date in there for your date of birth. It might have an integer for your age, and so on. However, the way we organize it is we organize it through some sort of ID, which might be an integer, which would be a unique student number, and then we then arrange that in an array. So we have an array of student IDs, which is then connected to the record, which is a student record. This is something that we'll look at much more detail next year in HSC, software design development. And finally, you have a file. A file basically is a container that contains different types of data types. So you might have Microsoft Word document, for example, which contains a string, but also can have different combinations inside it. Now, one of the questions that you always get asked in exams is, what are the weaknesses and strengths of each of the data types? Now, strings are really useful if you are not processing them, which means you are just storing text to be able to display it or do something with it. Now, you can process strings, but there is a little bit of complexity around them. When I refer to processing, I mean manipulating, changing them. Integers are really useful for positive and negative whole numbers. However, they're not very good for calculations as they don't do decimals. On the flip side, floating point or reals are really good for decimals, but if you need to use them as a counter because they have a decimal place, not really good data type to have. And then to round off our simple data types, Booleans are really important if you have a flag or condition that needs to be checked and it has to be true or false. Otherwise, they're not much use. You'll find that Boolean values are used quite a bit in our advanced control structures such as binary, multi-way, and our loops. Structured data types, obviously our array of a single data type is really important. If you need to process or search or sort through a list, it needs to be structured in an array. Some programming languages refer to this as a list or dictionary. There's different names out there for it, but basically they do the same thing. Multi-dimensional array, as I said before, it's really good if you need to compare more than one data type. And then the other types, such as records and that, are useful if you need to store different types of data structures under one particular container.